Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are diving into some really fascinating stuff today. The thought of Jose Ortega y Gasset,
Oh, a great one.
a truly significant voice in 20th century Spanish philosophy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is so compelling about Ortega y Gasset is his breadth.
Yes.
He wasn't just confined to one little corner of philosophy. He was a philosopher, but also a social theorist, an essayist, a critic, an educator, even involved in politics, and the driving force behind that influential journal, Revista de Occidente.
Yeah.
So he really grappled with a huge spectrum of themes. And I mean, his legacy includes some really, landmark works, Meditations on Quixote, The Revolt of the Masses, History as a System, Man and People, The Origin of Philosophy.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, what we want to do is really kind of get to the heart of Ortega's philosophy,
Okay.
focusing on those aspects that would particularly resonate, I think, with someone already deeply engaged in philosophical thinking,
Right.
like yourself. So we'll be tracing the arc of his intellectual development, seeing how he interacted with these major European philosophical movements, phenomenology, historicism, existentialism, and pinpointing those core concepts that really define his distinct philosophical contribution.
Okay, so to understand where he ends up,
Mhm.
I guess we need to start by looking at where he began. And his time in Germany seems to be pivotal, especially his deep engagement with German philosophy and neo-Kantianism.
Absolutely. His period of study at the University of Marburg was truly formative. He worked closely with Hermann Cohen and Paul Natorp, and Cohen in particular became kind of his primary intellectual mentor. And neo-Kantianism, with its emphasis on the mind's role in structuring reality, and Cohen's particular approach within that tradition had a profound impact on his early thinking. You see in his initial writings an effort to define philosophy in a way that was distinct from both the kind of purely speculative ideas of metaphysics on the one hand and the strict empirical focus of positivism on the other. He was looking for a third way.
So even early on, he was already charting his own course within these established schools of thought.
Precisely. Like Cohen, Ortega was critical of the natural sciences' epistemological approach to knowledge, meaning how they believe we come to know things.
Right.
He felt that their focus on naturalistic and psychophysical explanations of what idealists considered sensible reality, essentially trying to explain our experience through physical and psychological processes, was insufficient. However, while he held Cohen in high regard, Ortega didn't entirely follow him. Cohen, in a sense, attempted to derive the fundamental facts of science entirely from thought itself. Ortega, while maintaining certain neo-Kantian underpinnings, shifted the central focus. So instead of pure thought being kind of this ultimate reality, Ortega placed human life at the very center.
Human life is the bedrock of everything.
That's right. It was a significant move.
That sounds like a pretty fundamental redirection.
It really was, and his major works really orbit around this concept of life as a dynamic dialogue between the individual and the world. Unlike Cohen, whose primary concern was how our external experience depends on the principles of logic and mathematical physics, Ortega was more interested in the lived experience of being human.
Okay.
So he famously wrote that the structure of life is futurition, highlighting our inherent orientation towards the future, a key idea sparked by questions raised within Cohen's logic, but applied to the very different terrain of our lived, vital concerns.
So this shift towards human life really marks a pretty critical departure from that more absolute form of neo-Kantianism.
Yes.
Moving towards something much more grounded in our actual existence. And it was during this time in Marburg that he first encountered phenomenology.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Around 1911, he began engaging with Husserl's ideas, particularly in his seminal work Ideas, pertaining to a pure phenomenology. Initially, Ortega interpreted phenomenology as a kind of descriptive psychology, placing a strong emphasis on the pure description of essences, the fundamental, unchanging aspects of our conscious experience.
Okay.
He saw it as absolutely crucial to distinguish this essential intuition from a potentially misleading interpretation of phenomenology as simply empirical descriptive psychology, which he felt some might mistakenly derive from Husserl's earlier work, Logical Investigations.
So for Ortega in these early stages, phenomenology was really about meticulously describing the contents of consciousness, without making any claims about the external world or relying on empirical observation.
Exactly. He argued that psychological statements deal with concrete facts and are inherently empirical, whereas phenomenology, at least as it's presented into the open, ideas focus solely on the pure description of consciousness, of human consciousness. He was very clear that this new science of phenomenology was not psychology in the traditional sense, neither as an empirical science looking at behavior, nor as a metaphysical one speculating about the nature of the mind.
Right.
And what's particularly interesting for us as philosophers is that Husserl himself later echoed some of these very concerns in his Crisis of European Sciences, noting that certain aspects of his earlier work might have inadvertently led some readers towards a more psychological interpretation.
It's fascinating to see this early divergence.
Yes.
You know how Ortega was already carving out his own philosophical territory, even as he's grappling with these other major intellectual figures?
Exactly.
But his relationship with phenomenology wasn't a fixed point, was it?
No, it continued to evolve. While he was initially very attracted to phenomenology as this powerful method for understanding consciousness, he eventually developed a certain ambivalence, especially towards what's known as transcendental phenomenology, as Husserl outlined it in his formal and transcendental logic. Ortega felt that this later development leaned too heavily towards idealism, the idea that reality is fundamentally mental,
Right.
and didn't adequately address what he considered crucial humanity, life, and the functional character of reason. This is where his own concept of living reason comes into play, which he saw as fundamentally different from the phenomenological attitude described by Husserl in that particular work.
So living reason as something more rooted in our lived experience than a more abstract, transcendental approach to consciousness.
Precisely. He felt that Husserl's focus in this transcendental phase became too detached from the concrete lived reality of human existence. However, it wasn't a complete rejection of Husserl. He actually responded quite favorably to Husserl's later work, The Crisis of European Sciences, and its introduction of the concept of the Lebenswelt, the life world.
Right. That pre-theoretical world of everyday experience that forms the basis of our meaning-making.
Yeah.
And this idea resonated deeply with Ortega's own developing philosophy of human life and his concept of historical reason, which he later articulated in history as a system. He even claimed to have arrived at a similar understanding of the importance of the life world independently.
So that emphasis on the immediate lived world,
Right.
on our subjective experience as the starting point, became a point of significant convergence later on.
Yes.
Now, what about the philosophical challenge of understanding other minds?
Right.
The issue of intersubjectivity.
Yeah. That's another really interesting point of engagement between them. Ortega acknowledged Husserl as being the first to clearly define what he termed the appearance of the other as a radical and not merely psychological problem. In his work, Man and People.
However, while recognizing the significance of Husserl's framing of the problem and noting some admirable discoveries within Husserl's approach, Ortega felt that Husserl's proposed solutions to this problem were much less successful than his initial definition of it. Ortega himself delved into this complex issue in his essay, The Perception of One's Fellow Man, perhaps as an attempt to offer a different perspective and further differentiate his own understanding of how we come to know and relate to others.
Okay, so we see this really dynamic and nuanced interplay with German philosophy and phenomenology.
Yes.
This process of both drawing inspiration and offering critical departures.
That's right.
And this intellectual journey really lays the groundwork for understanding his own core philosophical concepts.
Right, it does.
And I think probably the most foundational of these is powerfully encapsulated in that phrase, I am I and my circumstances.
Absolutely. For Ortega, this isn't just a clever saying or a philosophical slogan. It's really kind of a fundamental characteristic of his entire philosophical outlook. It underscores this idea that human life is inextricably interwoven with its context, its specific circumstances.
Yeah.
For him, living is not an isolated act, but involves an ontological devotion to what is other, to the world that surrounds us. The I, the individual self, cannot be understood in isolation,
Right.
divorced from its environment, its history, its relationships. Your very being is defined by this constant interaction.
It's a very relational view of existence.
Absolutely.
And this directly informs his concept of perspectivism, doesn't it?
Yes, very directly. Perspectivism, as Ortega conceives it, is this profound idea that all historical epochs and all individual lives contribute a unique and valid perspective of truth to the totality of reality. He famously stated that every life is a point of view directed upon the universe.
Right.
And what he's suggesting here is that reality isn't some monolithic, objective entity that we can all perceive in exactly the same way.
Right.
Instead, it's something that achieves its fullness and richness through the diverse tapestry of these individual viewpoints.
Yeah.
Each perspective in its own way is legitimate and offers a crucial piece of the larger truth. There isn't a single privileged vantage point that holds the entire picture.
So there's no single absolute truth that we can definitively grasp, but rather a more complete understanding that emerges from the synthesis of all these different ways of seeing the world.
Precisely. And Ortega saw this as a really fundamental shift in 20th century thought, drawing this compelling analogy between his perspectivism and Einstein's special theory of relativity.
Oh, wow.
He argued that both represent a move away from the notion of a fixed objective reality, Einstein in the realm of physics, showing how observation itself influences what is measured, and Ortega in the realm of philosophy and human experience, highlighting how our individual standpoint shapes our understanding of reality. This was a revolutionary idea suggesting that truth itself is perspectival.
That's a really powerful analogy.
Right.
It helps to kind of situate his thinking within that broader intellectual upheaval of the 20th century.
Mm.
Now, another key concept in Ortega's philosophy is vital reason. And I understand this is very closely connected to his understanding of historicism.
Yes. Ortega emphasized that human life and human history are fundamentally vital dynamic processes. This aligns him more closely with Dilthey's crucial distinction between the natural sciences, Naturwissenschaften, which aim to explain the world through general laws, and the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften, which focus on understanding meaning and lived experience from within. While Ortega had studied in Germany earlier, he actually encountered Dilthey's work quite late, around 1929, and he acknowledged that it had a profound and significant impact on his intellectual development, even expressing regret that he hadn't engaged with it sooner.
So Dilthey's emphasis on understanding human experience from the inside, so to speak,
Yes.
deeply resonated with Ortega's own focus on human life as the central philosophical concern.
Exactly. Ortega understood historicism not as some rigid deterministic force that dictates the course of events,
Right.
as Karl Popper later critiqued, but rather as the dynamic dialogue that unfolds within the individual's life world. He was also significantly influenced by Benedetto Croce, who sought to historicize philosophy itself, to bridge what he saw as this false dichotomy between the study of eternal truths of philosophy and the ever-changing nature of history.
Right.
Both Ortega and Croce shared the view that human life is inherently historical, and that historical knowledge is absolutely crucial for gaining a deep understanding of human reality.
Mm-hmm.
Ortega's concept of historical reason can be understood as the synthesizing function, the way we make sense of our present by understanding its roots in the past, a form of reasoning that is itself shaped by history.
It sounds like he's arguing that to truly grasp what it means to be human, we can't just rely on abstract, timeless principles.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand human beings within their specific historical contexts.
Precisely. And this understanding of human life as fundamentally historical leads us directly to another core concept in Ortega's thought: human reality as the ultimate and primary reality. Ortega systematically developed this idea in significant works like Intorno a Galileo and History as a System. Here he moves beyond a purely biological or psychological understanding of life to conceive of it as a being that lives in the world, a concept that certainly shares some important similarities with Heidegger's De Science Analyse, his analysis of Dasein or being there, emphasizing this constant and interchangeable interaction between the I and its circumstances.
So much like Heidegger's idea of being fundamentally thrown into the world.
There are undeniable parallels in their thinking on this point, yes. Ortega also emphasized the crucial role of the vital horizon, that constantly shifting set of possibilities and limitations that define our lived experience.
Right.
However, it's also important to note that Ortega was quite sensitive to direct comparisons with Heidegger and was always keen to stress the originality and the earlier development of his own core ideas. But the shared emphasis on our fundamental being in the world as the starting point for philosophical inquiry is definitely a significant point of connection between them.
Now, shifting our focus beyond the individual, Ortega also developed some really influential ideas about social reality, the mass man, and mass society, which are perhaps some of his most widely recognized and discussed concepts.
Indeed. Ortega analyzed social reality through the lens of human interaction and individual modes of being. And he famously drew this distinction between creative select minorities and the phenomenon of the mass man and the resulting mass society.
Right.
And it's absolutely crucial to understand that these are not simply quantitative distinctions based on numbers.
Right.
Instead, they are fundamentally qualitative distinctions concerning one's attitude towards oneself and towards life. The select man, according to Ortega, is characterized by a deep and constant demand for higher standards upon himself, a commitment to cultivating his unique, radical reality, which might sometimes necessitate a deliberate withdrawal from the conformist pressures of the masses.
So it's about a particular kind of inner drive, a commitment to self-improvement and excellence,
Yes.
rather than just being part of a small elite group.
Right.
And this is what sets him apart from the mass man.
Precisely. The mass man in Ortega's analysis is characterized by a certain complacency, a lack of demandingness towards himself, and a tendency to be content with the status quo, readily adopting prevailing opinions without critical reflection. However, Ortega also recognized this necessary and dynamic interplay between the individual's need for desolitudinizing,
Right.
connecting with others through social interaction,
Yeah.
and the equally important occasional need for solitude and self-reflection to cultivate and nurture that unique individuality. It's a delicate balance between engaging with the social world and maintaining one's own distinct perspective and personal standards.
That makes perfect sense.
Yes.
We need both connection and a degree of separation for true individual development.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, let's delve into the concept of generation, temporality, historical reason, and critical philosophy of history, which really seems to weave together so many of the threads that we've been discussing.
Yes, this is where Ortega truly synthesizes many of his core insights. He viewed the concept of generation as this vital link connecting individual lives and the broader sweep of historical change, defined by both contemporaries, those living at the same point in time,
Right.
and coevals, those who share a similar age and formative experiences. Temporality, our lived experience of time, is absolutely central to Ortega's understanding of both individual human life and the unfolding of history.
Yeah.
He saw history as fundamentally a humanistic endeavor, a way of connecting the past to our present, it is, after all, our past,
Right.
and informing our understanding of who we are in the present through the cumulative actions and experiences of those who came before us.
So history isn't just a detached record of past events,
No.
but something that actively shapes our present identity.
Exactly.
Right.
And this leads directly to his concept of historical reason, which he carefully distinguished from the physico-mathematical reason that dominates the natural sciences.
Right.
He argued that history constitutes an autonomous and legitimate realm for understanding human reality, possessing its own unique kind of rationality and logic. He believed that concepts related to human life, values, beliefs, social structures are not timeless abstractions, but are inherently tied to specific historical times and contexts. For Ortega, modernity was marked by a growing consciousness of life's inherent precariousness, followed by this powerful reaffirmation of life through the exercise of creative freedom. He even boldly proclaimed that historical reason marks the true dawn of human history, signifying this new way of understanding ourselves.
That's a really powerful and optimistic statement.
It is.
It suggests a really fundamental shift in how humanity can understand its own journey and potential.
It does. Historical consciousness, for Ortega, empowers us to transcend the limitations of our own immediate time.
Right.
And expand our understanding of the full spectrum of the human condition by engaging with the experiences of those who came before us. And crucially, he emphasized that historical knowledge isn't passively received. It's an active process attained through the subjective experiences and interpretive efforts of the investigator, requiring a degree of imaginative projection, a point also strongly emphasized by thinkers like Collingwood. Ortega famously asserted, "The past is I by which I understand my life," powerfully illustrating that the past isn't some external entity, but is living and actively shaping who we are in the present.
Right.
His critical philosophy of history, therefore, becomes this profound synthesis connecting the temporal reality of human existence and the workings of the human mind, drawing insights from phenomenology, existentialism, and historicism to offer this really comprehensive and dynamic understanding of the human experience across time.
This has been an incredibly illuminating journey through some of the most significant aspects of Jose Ortega y Gasset's rich and complex philosophy.
Yes.
We've traced his intellectual development, explored his unique concepts like I am and my circumstances and perspectivism,
Yeah.
and delved into his really profound insights into the nature of history and human existence.
That's right.
It's clear that he was grappling with some of the most fundamental questions of being and our place in that vast sweep of time.
Absolutely. And I think some of the real aha moments for me in this discussion, and hopefully for you as well, include gaining a deeper appreciation for the fact that I in my circumstances is far more than just a mutable phrase. It's this profound ontological claim about the deeply embedded nature of human existence. The far-reaching implications of perspectivism suggesting that truth is not absolute, but inherently multifaceted and viewpoint-dependent are also incredibly thought-provoking. And the very nature of historical reason, this idea that history possesses its own unique form of logic and is absolutely integral to understanding who we are as individuals and as a species, is a truly powerful takeaway.
For anyone whose philosophical curiosity has been piqued by this discussion and who wants to explore Ortega's ideas further, I would certainly recommend delving into The Revolt of the Masses, which offers a still relevant and compelling analysis of modern society, or perhaps history as a system, to gain an even deeper understanding of his really groundbreaking views on time history and human existence.
And as a final thought for you, consider Ortega's profound and enduring emphasis on the crucial role of perspective in shaping our understanding of reality. In our increasingly interconnected yet often deeply polarized world, how might our comprehension of current global challenges fundamentally shift if we actively sought out and genuinely committed ourselves to understanding radically different viewpoints, even those that might initially seem completely alien or even contradictory to our own? It's a question that feels incredibly pertinent and challenging, even in our contemporary moment.
That's a great question.
Yes, it is.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll be back again soon with another deep dive into some more fascinating ideas and thinkers.
I look forward to it.
Until then, happy reading.
Yes. Happy reading.
And happy thinking.
Happy thinking.